Sir Sridhar Ramphal, Vice President and Minister Sidney Allicock, Minister...
May I use the coordinator prerogative? Minister Trotman, thank you for coming. Can we ask you to come forward?
Minister Trotman, ladies and gentlemen, especially students. We'll let the minister get comfortable. As the Minister of Natural Resources and the Environment, it is particularly important that you're here, sir. Thank you for coming. And ladies and gentlemen, especially students that are here, good evening and welcome to you all. It is a good evening to have a gaffe. And we really don't want this to be very professorial in nature. You know, I keep saying this and I keep not keeping my word. It's very difficult to relinquish microphones for those who teach for a living. We tend not to want to give it back. But Dr. David Singh is here to keep an eye on me. And at the very inception, I want to say to you all that this evening is about conversation. My job is simply to inject a few nuclei around which we hope to have that conversation. But it's really about you. And you have shown up in very, very encouraging numbers. I have trouble in Canada when I have one of these things. As you know, we have been running, as Annette said, we have been having carbon conversations for about 4 years now. And I can tell you that we have to use all kinds of incitements to get people to come. Whereas in Guyana, all we did was to advertise it, and you're all here. So thank you very much. Carbon is an interesting element. I see Marie Correa at the back, one of our very eminent young PhD chemists who the IAST lost to Israel. But she's back now, and we're hoping to keep her. And Marie will tell you that carbon is a very interesting element. Carbon, you see, is really entirely ubiquitous among us. Without carbon in our atmosphere, we would all freeze to death. So you're accustomed to hearing about the greenhouse effect. And nowadays, the greenhouse effect is a bad thing. But actually, without the greenhouse effect, our planet would be uninhabitable. So it is very important to have carbon in our atmosphere. At the same time, if we have too much carbon in our atmosphere, it begins to warm up. And this, of course, leads to climatic problems. But carbon goes deeper than this. Carbon, if you think of it, is at the fulcrum of civilization. Not only are our bodies made up of carbon, but carbon has been implicated with wealth for the longest period of time. Particularly our history, our colonial history, was built on the backs of carbon. Carbon, in this case, in the form of agriculture. Because the way the world regulates carbon in the atmosphere is through plants. Now, I promise I'm not going to throw any chemical formulas up, and there are no tests at the end of this. However, I do want to introduce or reintroduce to you photosynthesis. Now, for all the young students in the room, we know that plants make tissues by taking carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, in the presence of sunlight and water, and they make tissues. So when we grow crops, when we grow tobacco and sugarcane, what we're doing is we're growing carbon. We're making carbon-carbon bonds in those plants. So carbon has been implicated in colonialization. Carbon has been implicated in colonial wealth, the rise and sustainability of Western Europe, was built on the backs of its agriculture. And the existence that many of the colonies have had has been a result of policies generated by the necessity to control that carbon. So when we think of just carbon and climate change, we have to step back. Now, another way that carbon is stored is petroleum. When plants fix carbon in their tissues, and those tissues are buried for 700-800 million years, those tissues become fossil fuel. And then we harvest it. And we all know that those countries that have controlled fossil fuels have also controlled the world. So this thing about carbon is not only about forests, although that is an extremely important component of the equation, but it's also about wealth. It's about the hegemony of cultures. It's about art and our appreciation for aesthetics, because the aesthetics of our society increasingly continues to be set by mass media and culture, not necessarily always emanating from our own region. So this is why the carbon conversations is not only about climate change. It is also about wealth. It is about culture. It is about art. It is about science. And so I am delighted to be headlining the inaugural of these conversations, but they are not going to be successful unless you show up in these kinds of numbers and sustain them. And so I'm going to not speak a whole lot. I'm going to throw out a number of things. And I thought that a good menu would be to start with what I started, carbon being at the fulcrum of our world. But then to start to address some of the major resource challenges that our world currently faces. Many of you who are of a vintage similar to mine and above, and not the young people, but the young people should know about this book. Some of you would be aware of a wonderful book called The Limits to Growth. I know Sir Sridhar and Major General would know of this book. If it's gone through many editions, you need to pick it up. The Limits to Growth is about how much can we grow given the finite nature of the resources upon which we depend. And so, in a developing world like ours, resource scarcity and resource access becomes a very important pivot that we need to talk about. Among those resources, key among them, is food. And very much related to our ability to grow food is the whole issue around climate change. I intend to talk a bit about these issues and then place them within a Caribbean and Guyana context. And then to, however, move on from there to talk about some of the resource-driven opportunities for economic growth and development in our own country. Because our country, we have heard for a very long time, I am no spring chicken anymore, but I remember when I was a boy that I was told Guyana is rich in resources. And I'm 43 years old or so now, and I'm still being told we're rich in resource. I want to stop hearing that we're rich in resources. I want this discussion to go into third gear, and let's talk about how those resources are going to benefit us. So we talk about that tonight. I want to make a case that the exploitation of natural resources is a launchpad not only for growth and development, but for sustainable growth. And I want to talk about how that can be managed, and I can't do it unless I talk about governance. So again, Minister of Governance is here, so we're not picking on you, Minister, but we have to talk about it. And lastly, because all of you are young, and all of you came out, I want to talk about how bright your future is, because I do believe that it is an extremely bright future that we can look forward to. So, without much more ado, the Chinese have a wonderful saying. I don't know if Brian, you would have heard this saying growing up, given your ethnicity, but it's a curse. The Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. Now, if you were to be the kind of person like me and you look at headlines, here's one headline, not so long ago, where the world hit a serious economic crisis. Serious meltdown of the banks, the subprime mortgage crisis. We had major corporations going out of business, and the world went into a spiral, out of which we have not yet emerged. But what that did is it shifted attention from the fact that a mere 6 months before that, the world was grappling with a crisis of food. We were seeing images of the riots in Mexico and the food riots in Africa, where the tortilla wars had started up because of an ethanol lobby in the United States Midwest, and people were out of food. But we have become a society which seems to thrive off of headlines. We move from one wicked problem to the next, which engages our immediate concerns, and we forget that we haven't solved the others that continue to persist. And just before we were grappling with the end of food, by the way, we're still grappling with the end of food. The Caribbean is a net importer of food of about $4.5 billion US a year. $4.5 billion US dollars a year. So the food crisis hasn't gone away, and it's on our doorstep. But before that, we were grappling with the entire idea of a world without oil. In fact, oil had gotten so expensive, upwards of $100 a barrel, that we started mining the tar sands in Alberta at an energy return on investment which is almost prohibitive to mine that oil. But we were doing it because we couldn't do anything else. Venezuela and Saudi Arabia are the two last remaining discovered basins. I say discovered very carefully here. That has conventional oil. But we moved on from that. And pervasive all around this whole economic crisis and food crisis and oil crisis is the whole idea of climate change. And the impacts have not been without serious impacts on people's lives. So it forces you to ask, what really is happening? Are living in interesting times truly a curse? Because really, these are interesting times. But they call for very interesting solutions. They call for solutions that are done not by scientists and not by politicians alone. They call for solutions in unison. Solutions where we engage a full spectrum of people that will be affected, because none will be unaffected in the future that we're looking at. I want to add images to what I spoke about carbon. I said carbon photosynthesize, and they take carbon out of plants photosynthesize and they take carbon out of the atmosphere. But also, plants breathe, they respire, and they decay. They shed leaves and they shed limbs. It just so happens that the amount of carbon that plants remove from the atmosphere is about equal to the amount of carbon that they put back into the atmosphere. This is why we call it a carbon balance or a carbon cycle. There is just a very small amount of about 1 gigaton per year, which is actually sequestered. This is why it took about 700 million years for petroleum and fossil fuels to be formed, because it was being painstakingly accumulated at the rate of about 1 gigaton per year. But here's why climate change exists. This is what we do, okay? We're mining the tar sands, we're pumping fossil fuels out to the ground, and we pollute. We put carbon into the atmosphere, and we deforest. When we do that, what we've essentially done, remember it took 700 million years to build up our fossil fuel reserves. But we have only been using those fossil fuel reserves in any kind of large volume since the beginning of the Second World War. The beginning of the Second World War in 1944, 1945 heralded the beginning of the petrochemical industry. And the war effort needed fuel for the war machines. And that is when we began the massive large-scale utilization of petroleum. So since 1945 to 2015, a very, very short few decades, we have released 6 gigatons of carbon per year into the atmosphere, and we're only sequestering 1 gigaton. Our rate of release has outstripped the capacity of the carbon cycle to sequester. There's no magic about this equation. It is very real when your source and your sinks have different rates. Now, I know that in Guyana, we have talked about this for a lot. We've talked about carbon a lot. But I don't feel that we have understood that it's as simple as this. So that's why I wanted to throw that out. Okay. So what are we to do with this carbon then? We have this photosynthetically created carbon. We know we can grow soybeans, we can grow sugarcane. We'll talk a bit about sugarcane today because it's very appropriate, it's very, very topical. We can grow corn, we can grow all kinds of things. But we can also bury it, like we've been doing for 500, 600, 700 million years, and wait to harvest it as petroleum. I don't think that any one of you want to do that. We can use it as biofuels, right? I mean, the IAST has done some of this. We can continue to use it as food, as primary grains for ourselves, cereal, or as food for livestock. And I want to talk about that a bit. Or 16% of all the petroleum we pump out of the ground goes into making materials. If you look around this room and on yourselves, and I don't mean to be insulting, I will bet you everybody in this room is wearing at least 20% plastic. It's kind of kitsch. A 1965 Chevy Impala had about 3% plastic in it. It was all in the form of rubber seals. A 2015 Chevy Impala has 80% plastic. 1963 Panhead Harley Davidson, it's a gorgeous machine. It has no plastic on it. There's a hard seat made out of linseed oil. That's it. 2015 Fat Boy, 85% plastic in it. The only thing that's metal are the wheels and the engine. Plastic around us is ubiquitous. Or where do we think this plastic comes from? Right? Imagine Christmas without plastic. Right? I mean, you're in trouble. That plastic comes from petroleum. 15% of all the petroleum we take out of the ground goes into the petrochemical industry, and most of it is plastic. Now, this is an interesting menu of options. When we used to grow crops, and the plantocracy would ship sugar and tobacco back, life was a little bit simpler. But now our carbon has to compete for very different marketplaces. So therefore, the timeline of primary production, utilization, release, and subsequent sequestration will and does have tremendous impact on free carbon into the atmosphere. We run into things like the efficiencies of production. Our country has a growing season that is interspersed by 2 rainy seasons. Countries like the Netherlands and Canada in temperate zones have 1 growing season. The efficiencies of our agricultural production are way less than the efficiencies of those countries that have shorter and limited growing seasons. Across the border in Brazil, they grow sugarcane to the extent where their cost to make food sugar is about 10 cents a pound. In Guyana, I think our cost is between 27 and 35 cents per pound. If you're going to grow carbon, you have to grow carbon efficiently. So efficiency is a very important thing for us if we want to be effective at competing in the carbon world, because it is a carbon world. Political and geopolitical trade zones availability of arable land and water. I want to talk a little bit about that as well. Market forces and speculation, all will determine how we use that carbon. So it's not okay only to grow sugarcane cheaply at the fields. It's also important to understand how to manage speculatory forces, how to trade futures, how to hedge your bets. In other words, what is important to us is to understand the entire vertical integration of our agricultural or our carbon industry, if as a country again. Now, what does that mean? What it means to you young people is that the kinds of jobs that you have been traditionally accustomed to thinking about has now simply expanded exponentially. Because saying that you want to work in agriculture doesn't any longer mean that you're going to be a rice farmer. I see some rice farmers here. It doesn't mean that you have to buy a combine. It doesn't mean, it might mean that you have to buy a cellular phone like the one that Dane Gobin has with him, a large one. Because you'll need a large phone to count the amount of money you make. The money in agriculture is made on the cell phone. It's made selling futures. It's made understanding what the climatic zones are doing in sub-Saharan Africa and what is happening geopolitically in Zimbabwe, so that we know what will happen to food prices tomorrow and next year. So the jobs that you can look forward to in our country to grow and use and sell trade carbon are significantly expanded. I want to take this whole carbon conversation outside of just deforestation, which is a very important, crucially important aspect, but also to put it back squarely in agriculture. And let's think about this for a second. Why is agriculture important to climate change? When we grow crops and we use those crops as food or materials or plastics, the carbon from those crops are recycled. They go back into the atmosphere. But that released carbon is sequestered by next year's crop cycle. Agriculture provides a shunt to the carbon cycle. It adds more photosynthetic machines, so it's a good thing. So let's talk about resource scarcity. And of course, we can't talk about any resource without talking about energy, because we live in an energy world. If you were to look at the per capita consumption and access to power and energy, it's directly correlated with our best measure of well-being, the Human Development Index. Those countries where people have access to energy all have a standard of living which is directly proportional to the level of that access. That is not me making that up, that is the UNDP data. This is without doubt the truth. Where does that energy come from? A full 83% of the world's energy are still derived from fossil fuel resources. 83%. Although we've seen massive developments in hydropower and biomass and nuclear, we're still deriving more than 80% from fossil fuels. What's going to happen to fossil fuels? We talk about alternative energy, but we have 7 billion people in the world today, and we think we're going to have 9 billion people in the world by 2050. Now, we had a crisis in the 70s when we thought that the world would hit 5 billion people. We hit 7, and we're headed to 9. But it's not just more people eating more. It's also changing patterns. 500 million Chinese people are now becoming middle class. What do we do? What the consumption patterns tell us what we do? When we have disposable income, the first thing we start to do is we start to eat meat. Second thing is we buy a car. But why is this meat so important? It takes 7 units of grain, 7 units of grain, to make 1 unit of meat. So the conversion for beef is that the beef must eat 7 kilograms of oats or barley in order to make 1 kilogram of beef. So what we do immediately is we place an uncompromising and unrelenting pressure on our agriculture, photosynthetic carbon, in order to feed our consumptive patterns as our consumption changes because we have disposable income. So the demand for fossil fuels go up because how do we do agriculture? We spend energy to do that agriculture. And we begin to drive. So we increase the demand for fuel. As a result, this is what the population of the earth is doing, and this is what our consumptive patterns are doing. Direct correlation. There is no hocus pocus about this. This is a fact of our consumptive patterns. That's the long-term forecast. This is what the short-term forecast tells us. This is actual data. This is what's happening. Our consumption is going up every single day. Now, currently, we have about 2 to 3 million barrels a day of production surplus. That is constantly shrinking. As the demand climbs, and as OPEC begins to have trouble, so let's take a diversion. Shale gas. Shale gas appeared on the horizon. Shale gas is kind of a horrible thing. What they do is they inject steam into the earth, they fracture the shale, and they inject out the gas that's buried. But there are tremendous amount of shale gas in continental USA, in Russia, and in other places. So as environmentally controversial as that is, shale gas is actually a game changer. Shale gas is cheap. So what happened? What happened? As the capital expenditure, now you can have a cheap resource, and this is important to us to learn. You can have a cheap resource out there, but in order to access that resource, you need to create capital plans. So you don't have to just worry about the resource being cheap. You have, and Chris, you can jump into this, I'm sure. You have to ensure that you can raise the capital and that you can service the capital. So although shale gas might be cheaper than conventional oil, shale gas still needed capital plants in order to run it. So what does OPEC do? OPEC opens the pipe a little bit more. And what happens? The price of petroleum comes down. And when the price of petroleum comes down, the differential between shale gas and conventional oil shrinks. As that differential sinks, none of the banks and none of the hedge funds will give you money for capital for shale gas. So as a result, what OPEC has done to shale gas is it's killed shale gas for at least 10 to 15 years. If you're wondering why petroleum is $60 a barrel today, it is because of the Saudi lobby and the OPEC decision to ensure that shale gas goes under. So where are oil prices headed? Only up. Because now that they've broken the backs of shale gas, you watch the surplus come down. For running our television sets, for all of the creature comforts that we have become accustomed to, we are not about to walk away from hydrocarbons. But the end of oil is not a debate. The tipping point might be a debate. At what point will we outstrip demand, will outstrip discovery of new reserves? But the end of oil is not a debate. We will run out of fossil fuels. And this has massive implications for countries like Guyana that are on the cusp of entering the fossil fuel industry. What it means is that if we at all want to be sustainable, we've got to begin to think of what happens when the oil runs out. Let us not be so myopic as to repeat the mistakes of neighboring countries like Trinidad, for example, which devastated their agricultural base because oil royalties were running free. And now we have the entire rural Trinidad and Tobago is destroyed. Completely destroyed. Not only in terms of the agriculture, but because of the morale of the people as well, if you visit Trinidad and Tobago. So as we head into a potential hydrocarbon industry here, we must be very careful to understand not only is it finite, but it gives us opportunities which must be handled wisely. In my opinion, expensive energy is the single largest barrier to increased manufacturing, value-added processing, mechanization of our agriculture, large-scale mining, and quality of life in Guyana. Without a doubt, I have no fear of anybody arguing with me on this. This is a fact. We spend, what, $65 a kilowatt hour in this country compared to cents elsewhere. How can we compete? 94% of all the energy consumed in Guyana is imported. 94%. For electricity, for transportation, for security, for business. And we spend, depending on how you count it, between 45 and 55% of that of the GDP. 45 to 55% of the gross domestic product of this country goes into importing fuel. That's staggering. The macroeconomic reality of that is staggering. So this energy crisis, and we are in an energy crisis, it requires, first of all, it's a tripod of requirements, I believe. It requires political will. Without political will, you know, I was giving one of these talks to the Commonwealth heads, the Commonwealth ambassadors in Canada. And the Nigerian ambassador said to me, High Commissioner, I think they call it, the Nigerians are High Commissioners, right? They said to me, but what's the solution? Our decision-making process across this world, in various forms of democracy, still revolves around one single process for change. We haven't had a real revolution in a while. So that process for change is what? It's political will. Political will is the single most important pivot for change. Without political will, change doesn't happen unless you have revolution. The issue is that these wicked problems that we face have life cycles which outstrip the political cycle. The political cycle in Guyana is what, 5 years? But some of the solutions to these problems are not 5 years. They're 10 years, they're 15 years. So this is why political will is important. The job of the politician is to get re-elected. Or so we think. But if we are going to worry about being re-elected and we're not going to worry about fixing problems, then political will be simply a whimper. So political will is a tripod, part of the tripod. The other tripod is political will needs to enable policy. Policy is the single most important way to ensure when one political party leaves and another one enters, that some remnants, some continuity for solutions can be kept. And that policy, those policies need to be created and crafted not only by political directorates, but by engaging you. And this is why carbon conversations is so powerful. Because as you begin to be engaged, and I'm so very happy that we have two senior ministers of government here, because what this says to the ministers is that you're interested, that this is important to you. And you are important to them because you vote. Right? So this is conversation, and advocacy is pivotally important. And thank you again for coming out. Once we have those two things, marrying investment and technology to create affordable, sustainable energy solutions become very well within our grasp. But we must have those two things in Guyana. And in Guyana, we have a very, very good menu of options for how we can look at alternative energy. This country has 300% of its equivalent diesel demand in waste biomass. 300% of its equivalent diesel demand in waste biomass. We don't do anything with it. This country has tidal rivers everywhere. We don't have small micro-hydros to handle it. Yet the investments in those hydros are minuscule and the returns are as short as 4 to 5 years. 25% ROIs in a country like ours. We have good opportunities for wind. Our hinterland presents some opportunities for photovoltaic. And we do still have some geothermal and other kinds of opportunities. I put nuclear here at the bottom because, for obvious reasons. But as we go about this portfolio, and I'm advocating very strongly here, a portfolio. There are no magic bullets. We need to harness all that we can harness. And we need to ensure that when we make revenues from the fossil fuel economy that's about to emerge, that we invest in these. Because these are the ones that are going to ensure that we continue to have access to energy. All right, enough about energy. Let's talk about metals, because Guyana has a significant amount of metals. When you think of metals, I may be doing you a disservice. You might be thinking about some of the things that I want to talk about. But traditionally, people of my generation, when we talk about metals, we talk about finger ring and gold ring and gold teeth, you know. Precious metals. But silver. There are no more silver mines in the world. No more. We are not discovering any more new silver mines in the world. The silver in our world, what is it used for? Increasingly, silver is used in electronics. By far, the largest use of silver is in your television sets, it is in your computers, it is in Dean Gobin's phone, it is in every single bit of electronic that you have. Without silver, the electronic industry dies. And we're not discovering any more silver. And what have we done with the silver? We mine it, and then it goes into circuitry. And now they're putting it into socks. Right, Marie? They're putting nano silver into socks so it doesn't stink, because it's a good biocide. And those nano silver then ends up in the wastewater and creates issues for algal growth. But that's a different issue that we're not going to talk about today. Silver, though, is a problem, right? It's a problem. When we put it into circuitry, we distribute it. We take it from concentrated mines and we distribute it around the world. Physicists call that increasing the entropy. We've increased the entropy of the silver. In order to get that silver back in one place so it can be in manufacturing, takes a lot of enthalpy. Enthalpy and entropy are like yin and yang, right? If you create entropy, it takes energy or enthalpy to bring it back together. What does that tie back to? Fossil fuels and alternative energy. So, precious metals like silver are very important to think about. And in a Guyana context, it's extremely important to think about, because we have not done the right kinds of assays to ascertain how much silver we have in this country. We need to begin to do that. What we do is we mine. We literally go into cities like London, like Prague, and we mine palladium off the walls of buildings. Platinum and palladium has become so scarce. Try buying your girlfriend a platinum ring now. Mr. Tiwari, if you go to King's to buy a platinum ring, it's very expensive, you know. I mean, a man of your stature can afford it, but me, I can't afford that. You know, very expensive, very, very, very expensive, platinum. Because we ain't got it anymore. We're washing the sides of buildings where the catalytic converters of cars have deposited it. On the other side of our business, we take all the old phones, like when Dane throw away his, and we collect all the silver. We collect all the gallium. We collect all the lead. And we recycle it, because it's cheaper now to recover it from the phones than it is to actually go and find it and mine it. So the mining, if you want to call it, prospecting, you're prospecting for metals in computers and phones. It's no longer in the earth. So if young people, think about that. Agriculture, let's talk about agriculture. Make no mistake, if you say you're a farmer, you're an energy guzzler. The price of commodities are directly related to the price of energy. There's no question, it tracks entirely the same. Mr. Durga, you're here, you're a rice farmer or a retired rice farmer. You can tell us about the energy cost of rice. It's prohibitive. But what are we facing in agriculture in the world? What are we facing in agriculture? Production is down, hunger is up, and prices are rising. This is real data. The Australian food bowl just came out of a 12-year drought. Coffers are low. Zimbabwe, one of the largest producing, David is going to limit me, so I'm going to go fast. Largest producing countries since Mugabe's expulsion of the expatriates is now a food importer. The Caribbean is a net food importer. Suriname, Belize, and Guyana, the potential producers of agriculture in the Caribbean, we ourselves import food. We import food in this country. You just have to go into the supermarket shelves. I was aghast. I went to Mabaruma, which is one of my favorite places in Guyana, and one of the shops were selling packaged coconut milk. God. And they're carrying it on the shelves because when we cook up rice, we use it, but we don't pick the coconuts, And I remember my job used to be to sit on the grater and grate the thing, And it used to be funny because if you have a neighbor and you grow up in the country, Dave, you remember this, because I know you like to write about these things. After you wash the coconut the first time, and if the neighbor ain't got a little boy to grate the coconut for shish, he says, neighbor, can I have the second wash? Food. Problem. This is the OECD outlook for food prices. It's going to go up and it's going to stay up. What is that going to mean to the lowest people in our economic ladder? It's going to be disastrous. This is an important slide. On your left of this slide is the amount of arable acreage that we have to put under irrigation. Look at that. You can fit a perfect exponential curve to that increase. We are increasingly having to irrigate our arable acreage in order to keep them productive. In the middle, shows you the amount of arable land per population, per capita, that we have left in the world. And on the other side, it shows you the exponential shrinkage of arable land left for people. Why does that happen? Lack of land stewardship, lack of water management of ecosystems, lack of caring for the land. Remember Adam Smith? There were three inputs: land, labor, and capital for wealth of nations. Land, labor, and capital. If you only worry about the labor and the capital, and you don't worry about the land, you lose it. If you're not good stewardship of land, you lose it. And that is what we've been doing, right? We've been desertifying land. This is crucially important for Gaisuko, phosphorus. Now, plants go through something called mitosis and meiosis. It is impossible for plants to do mitosis without phosphorus. Plants can't grow without phosphorus. God in making no more phosphorus. The Earth's crust only got as much phosphorus as it has. We don't make elements. We're not alchemists. We can't take lead and make phosphorus. And what we have done to phosphorus is by 2050, we out of phosphorus that we can mine. That's not conjecture. That's true. What's going to happen to places like Gaisuko, who are already limping along, is they will completely die. Phosphorus is probably now one of the largest inputs, fertilizer, which will have phosphorus in it. But we can do things like recover phosphorus. In fact, we're throwing away. When we burn our bagasse at Gaisuko, because we're not leaching the phosphorus out of it, we're burning phosphorus. We're putting it in the stacks. We need to begin to change that immediately. You know where they get phosphorus now? The main source? They have these islands in the Pacific, which were coral islands, but bats nested on them. And the bat poop would build up, the guano would build up, and they have now eradicated those islands for phosphorus. Bat poop phosphorus. We're running out of that too. And habitats. So I want to say this, that the most important resources of the future are not petroleum. They are not steel, and they are not precious metals. I firmly believe that those most important resources are arable land, fresh water, and skilled labor. Because without those three things, it doesn't matter how much oil you have, you can't eat it. Caribbean context, we know this. We're a net importer of energy. TNT and Suriname are the only two with production. TNT is a net exporter. Suriname is nearing that point. We import about 32% of our energy completely in the region. I have to show this. Here's why there's hope. Remember geography class? So we were told that there are 5 tectonic plates, and those plates used to be closer, and then over a few hundred million years the plates moved. Petrochemically, thanks David, the West African coast and the South American coast sat on adjacent plates. And the great tidal rivers that we have in this region and in West Africa deposited over hundreds of millions of years plankton and other marine environment into the continental shelf. And because of the sediments that flowed down those rivers, that plankton was buried under what we call geological traps, hard shale and hard sands. And over time, that cooked into giant reserves of petroleum. Why do we know? The petrochemical fingerprints of reserves that have been found in wells like the Jaguar well, the Eagle well, the Horseshoe well, the latest Exxon well, and that has been found off the West African coast are the same fingerprint. But off the West African coast, we have what is referred to as elephant finds, large deposits of conventional sweet crude. So, I am a betting man, and I am betting that we are about to enter a large petroleum business in Guyana. The Exxon discovery, we believe, is significant and real, and we look forward to significant ones. But this is why I'm spending so much time talking about food. This is why I'm spending so much time talking about petroleum being finite. This is why I'm talking about phosphorus and silver and precious metals. Because if we don't use the potential revenues from this industry to develop the industries that are more sustainable, then we would have been doomed to repeat the bitter mistakes that others have done. Let us not do that. I'm making a real important call to all of you. Do not let this happen to this country. It would be a sin. It would be a sin. Petrochemically, in terms of the petroleum industry, we've owned, since the 1960s, only 26 wells were drilled in this region. Only 26 since 1960. But within the next 3 years, we have about 9 wells being drilled in this basin, including those from CGX, but Cosmos, Exxon, Tullow, Cepsa, Petronas, Impex. So what I'm saying is the amount of economic activity that's going to be in this basin over the next 3 years. We're talking about billions of US dollars, and that's another thing I want to say to the young people. Begin to understand how you can be a part of that. We know the gold and metals, the gold industry in Guyana is untouched. We do alluvial mining, saprolithic mining. At this day and age, the only hard rock mine in this country is about to come on stream shortly. We have not touched our gold. And you know what? Gold mining can be done very, very environmentally friendly. Not the way we do it now with mercury all over the place. We are signatories to the Minamato Convention, and we need to be serious about it. We need to ensure that policy is in place and policed, because what we do in the interior with mercury, David and Dane, you're there all the time, Sydney, you're there. If you fly over, it's like scars on this country. We've got to stop it because it's stupid. It's stupid. We don't have to use mercury. There are much more effective ways, activated carbon and cyanide. And actually, the returns on investment are higher because the extractive efficiencies are higher. There's no reason for us to do it. But gold is a very important thing. I said that the Caribbean is the next net importer of food. I think I've talked about this. We only have 16 million people, but we import food. Every single country. Look at the amount of food they import. Every single country in the Caribbean. I ain't making this up. This is true. But why? Why is it that Belize, Guyana, and Suriname has not risen to their promise of being the breadbaskets of the Caribbean? And I include the other countries too, it's not just us. It's because look at the amount of foreign direct investment that we have. 0.3% of the world's foreign direct investment is what this region receives. For whatever reason. Is it because we're backwards? Is it because our level of education is low? Is it because we have fractured political systems? Whatever it is, those are real numbers. What the extractive industries has the potential to do for us, it has the potential for us to use our own capital from those industries to put into food production, to put into alternative energy. So we don't have to wait for FDI to come here if we're in those industries. And so I'm making a clear case that we are not, it doesn't make sense to forego our extractive industries in the interest of just environmental good. But that those industries can be operated under strict guidelines with minimal impacts, and that they are absolutely crucial to the developmental trajectory of this country. To forego them is simply to be silly and to bury our heads in the sand. But in order to do them well, we need good governance, good science, and we need to engage our public, like you're doing tonight. We've talked about climate change. I like to say, you know, the Caribbean is one of the most vulnerable places. The banana trees, they just got to hear the hurricane coming, and they just lie down. So it's trouble. We have an economy that is not resilient to climate change. We need to look at that. Labor. I'm getting to the end, David. Labor. I mean, you can't have one of these conversations without talking about all the nuclei. Labor is crucially important. Remember Adam Smith? Land, labor, capital. We talked about land. What about labor? The birth rate in Western Europe and North America is way outstripped by the growing demand for labor. The birth rate in Canada is about 1.96, and they need to be 3 in order to retain their competitive advantage. The birth rate in Japan is completely negative. Japanese people ain't making picnic. Right? The only place in the world that the birth rate is actually up to the task is in Southeast Asia. So we're talking about Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. And people leave in Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore because they are the giants in the world in terms of growth. And Africa. The problem with Africa is we have 65% AIDS and a grade 3 education. So where is the world's labor to come from? And in the Caribbean, we neglect our academic institutions. I'm not attacking the University of Guyana, but the University of Guyana is woefully inadequate to even provide our labor. I have students coming to me from the University of Guyana that doesn't know how to write. Yet, look at what's happening in China. Look at what's happening in the United States, in Western Europe, in Japan, in Asia. This is the Chinese data. Labor is the largest problem. So if this region does not begin to address its high schools, its nursery schools, its university, and we stop this silliness of our university and your university, the Caribbean barely has 16 million people. It's a small city in the United States. Yet, we don't break down the halls of academia and allow us to collaborate. We hardly have a tax base in some countries, yet we have full cabinets, replete with pomp and ceremony too. We live in an archipelago which has barely 16 million people. And in our country, we barely have 750,000 people. Can we really afford not to partner with University of the West Indies and Anton de Camp? We don't have critical mass, guys. We need to remove that fracture and begin to address labor now. All right, winding down. Given the growing demand for petroleum and predicted increases in prices, the diminishing supply of precious metals, rare earths, and electronic industrial metals, predicted continued high prices of gold as the financial uncertainty persists, and the emergent petroleum and extractive sector in the Caribbean, I firmly believe that Suriname and Guyana, and to a lesser extent Trinidad, are poised to enjoy financial success. We've got all the elements of financial success for today's problems. The global supply and demand of natural resources will determine our national uses and access. Don't for a moment believe that we can protect resources here. Everything that happens with resources is set by world supply and demand. Demand will continue to outstrip supply despite any new supply of petroleum or metals we put in. And of course, the extractive industries by their very nature are finite and not sustainable in the long term. Therefore, their exploitation must be accompanied by investments in sustainable industries and environmental stewardship, or Adam Smith's land. Given the Caribbean's severe lag in foreign direct investment and its relatively poor access to capital, its severe shortage of skilled labor in general, and in particular related to low population and fractured labor force, CSME, I don't know what's happening, and its precarious position with regards to food security and vulnerability to climate change, the region must exploit its natural resources to invest first and foremost in skilled labor, in large-scale sustainable agriculture for food production, in alternative energy, and don't look to North America. Our neighbors have done this very well. In climate abatement and adaptation and environmental stewardship, and in renewable technologies. How do we do this? As I said before, political will and policy, important. So it will require robust governance and policy development. It will mean investing in a non-extractive sector and technology, and that's not a pathway well followed by most people in the world. It will obviously mean having zero tolerance to corruption. And in case you think I'm bringing this up now, I gave this exact same presentation in Suriname, where is Ronald Ali? About a year ago. It will mean having policies to ensure we are not commodity producers, but value adding is done right here, right at home. And I believe it will mean regional integration in a real and meaningful way, because it's simply not sustainable to have national coffers predicated on less than 1 million people. It's just silly. I want to heavily endorse this. Stefan Heck and Matt Rogers from McKinsey Group, and I'm going to leave that there because I don't have time to discuss it. I do believe that our future is bright, because our future are about choices. Guyana has a menu of choices to choose from. And as long as you continue to engage and discuss with each other, we'll make the right choice. But we have to do it together. We have to do it together. I'm going to skip these slides because we can talk about it another time. But I want to leave it here. The average age in this room is very encouraging to me. And I want to say to all of you, make no small plans, because they lack the will to stir souls. Thank you very much.